Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today, for a change, something light-hearted awaits you. One of the most famous comedies in Russian literature, a play full of mistaken identity, vanity, and gentle mockery. The Government Inspector by Nikolai Gogol, published in 1836. We travel to a small, sleepy provincial town where none of the officials has a clean conscience. And we watch what happens when a rumor makes the rounds that a high inspector from the capital is secretly on his way. Lean back, let go of the day, and smile with me at the follies of men. In a small Russian town that dozed away in cozy drowsiness, far from all the great roads, the mayor one day gathered the town's notables around him in great agitation. He had, he said, a most unpleasant announcement to make to them. An inspector was on his way, a high official from the capital, and he was coming incognito, that is, in all secrecy and unrecognized, to examine the town's administration. This news struck like a bolt of lightning, for every one of the assembled gentlemen had ample reason to dread an inspection. The mayor himself had been taking bribes for years, kept the merchants on tenterhooks, and ran things as he saw fit. The judge, a passionate hunter, let himself be paid for his favors in the form of hunting dogs, and his court had not seen a shred of order in living memory. The warden of the charitable institutions saved money on the sick wherever he could, and in his hospital, the patients lay unkempt and left to themselves. The postmaster opened other people's letters out of sheer curiosity and read them with pleasure before sending them on, and the school inspector trembled before every authority. They all heard the tidings with horror, for they knew that a thorough inspection could ruin every last one of them, and in the worst case, even send them to Siberia. The mayor, who knew his flock, hastily gave instructions on how to meet the looming disaster. The hospital must quickly be given a proper coat of paint, the sick fitted with clean caps, and care taken that at least outward appearances were preserved. They were to sweep the street in front of the town hall and do everything possible to make a good impression on the exalted guest. While he was still eagerly issuing his orders, and the assembled officials talked over one another in headless busyness, no one suspected that the true calamity was already lodged in the town in the shape of a quite different, most inconspicuous man, who sat facing his fate in a shabby room at the inn. In that very inn, whose importance no one yet suspected, a young man from the capital had been staying for the past fortnight, a certain Klestakov, in the company of his servant, Osip. This Klestakov was a petty, insignificant official of low rank, frivolous, vain, and without a kopeck in his pocket, for he had lost all his money at cards while traveling through on his way to his father's estate. Now he was stranded, unable to pay his bill, and getting by on an empty stomach and ever more brazen promises, while the innkeeper was already threatening to give him nothing more to eat. His servant, Osip, a level-headed, worldly wise fellow, lay meanwhile hungry on his master's bed and held a dry conversation with himself about the good-for-nothing ways of his young master, who threw money about with both hands and now found himself in this sorry plight. So while Klestakov sat in his shabby room, fretting over his empty purse and his growling stomach, the two garrulous landowners, Bobchinsky and Dobchinsky, forever running about the town in search of news, had discovered him at the inn. They saw a strange young man from the capital who had already been living here for 2 weeks, observing everything closely, peering into the pots and plates of the other guests and settling no bill. And at once everything fell into place in their excited heads. This had to be him, the dreaded inspector, going about his business here incognito. Breathless, the two hurried to the mayor and laid their thrilling discovery before him, and the mayor, whose guilty conscience scented danger everywhere in any case, was instantly convinced. The inspector had been found. In feverish haste, he resolved to pay his respects to the exalted gentleman without delay, to receive him with every conceivable courtesy, and, if need be, to soften him with a small gift of money. He threw on his finest uniform, admonished his household, and set off for the inn with a pounding heart to confront the supposed inspector, never suspecting how greatly he was deceived in the unremarkable young man. When the mayor entered the shabby inn-room in his dress uniform, there followed a meeting in which the two men talked past each other, each trapped in his own fear. Klestakov, believing they meant to throw him into debtor's prison over the unpaid bill, at once went on the offensive, shouted and worked himself up, complained about the bad food, and threatened grandly that he knew high gentlemen in the capital. The mayor, however, took this brazen outburst for the confident bearing of a powerful official wishing to preserve his incognito, and the louder Klestakov blustered, the deeper the intimidated mayor bowed. In his fear, he quickly slipped the astonished young man a tidy sum of money, which the latter, delighted and without asking many questions, accepted with thanks, for the unexpected gift seemed to him a windfall from heaven. Now the mayor was fully convinced that he had won the inspector's favor, and he invited him to leave the wretched inn and take up quarters in his own house. Klestakov, to whom these people's change of heart was at first a riddle, gladly accepted the invitation, and so he moved into the mayor's comfortable house, where he was received with exquisite courtesy. They showed him around, displayed the town's institutions to him, and entertained him in the finest style. And gradually, Klestakov began to suspect that some misunderstanding must be at play, and that they took him for a far more important person than he truly was. Yet, instead of clearing up the error, the frivolous young man resolved to enjoy to the utmost the good fortune that had so unexpectedly fallen into his lap. Over a lavish meal, in high spirits and emboldened by wine, he gave free rein to his boastfulness and served up the most outlandish tales to the reverently listening company. Emboldened by wine and spurred on by the admiration of his listeners, Klestakov worked himself up into ever more magnificent tall tales. He told them that in the capital he lived in a splendid house, gave brilliant parties, and mingled with the very highest personages. Soon he claimed that he was on intimate terms with ministers, indeed, that he himself essentially ran important affairs of state, and that, when he appeared at the ministry, everyone trembled before him. He had written the most famous works of literature, hosted magnificent balls at which the soup was brought in especially from Paris, and the most distinguished counts and princes were forever at his door. With every sentence his inventions grew bolder and more contradictory, yet the assembled company listened to him open-mouthed and with growing awe. The more incredible his boasts, the deeper the bows, for in their fear and awkwardness, not one of the officials noticed how deeply the great man was entangling himself in absurdities. The mayor and his people exchanged meaningful glances and saw their worst fears confirmed. Here sat a man of enormous influence who absolutely had to be kept in good humor. When at last Klestakov, weary from all his talking and heavy with wine, retired to rest, the notables conferred behind their hands about how grave the situation was. The next morning they reached a decision. Each of them wished to present himself separately before the dreaded inspector, to pay him his respects and, under one pretext or another, to win his favor with a sum of money. In this way, they hoped to draw the powerful man over to their side and sweep their own transgressions under the carpet before he could bring them to light. The next morning, a veritable procession of petitioners began. One after another, the town's notables came into Klestakov, each on his own, each hoping to secure the favor of the powerful man. First came the judge, stiff with nervousness, and when, in his agitation, the money slipped from his hand, Klestakov pretended it was a loan and pocketed the sum with perfect composure. The shrewd young man had quickly grasped what a profitable game presented itself here, and with each following visitor, he now asked of his own accord for a loan, now for this sum, now for that, and everyone gave willingly, glad to get off so lightly. The postmaster, the school inspector, the warden of the charitable institutions, they all went their way, relieved, and parted from their money. The two garrulous landowners, Bobchinsky and Dobchinsky, let themselves be fleeced as well. Klestakov, who now saw through the whole affair completely, was hugely amused at the gullibility of these provincials, and found himself, all at once, come into money and standing. In a letter to a friend in the capital, a man of the pen to whom he liked to report his adventures, he described the whole delightful mix-up and made merry at the expense of the foolish officials, singling out each one with a mocking remark. This letter he handed in to be sent, without considering into whose hands it might fall. But his high spirits did not stop there. Klestakov, with fortune simply pouring in on him, now also cast an eye on the ladies of the house, and began to pay pretty flatteries both to the mayor's wife, the vain Anna, and to his daughter Maria. Klestakov's boldness now knew no bounds. Scarcely had he paid the mayor's wife his gallant compliments than he turned to the daughter Maria, and before anyone knew it, he was extravagantly asking for her hand. The mayor and his wife were beside themselves with joy and pride, for what a glittering prospect opened up. Their daughter married to so exalted and influential a gentleman from the capital. At once, they saw themselves in their minds rising to honor and dignity, and they forged the finest plans for their future distinguished position. The notables were called together to announce the happy engagement, and the mayor could scarcely contain his self-satisfaction at the thought of his distinguished son-in-law. Klestakov, however, frivolous as he was, still had wit enough to recognize that it was time to make himself scarce before the swindle came to light. His servant Ossip, far cleverer than his master, and long aware of the danger of the situation, urged him to a hasty departure. So Klestakov explained to the mayor that he had to travel for a short while to settle an urgent matter with a rich uncle, but would return without delay to celebrate the wedding. The mayor, suspecting nothing, and wholly filled with his good fortune, had the best horses harnessed for the departing bridegroom, gave him a further handsome sum as travel money for the road, and saw him off with every honor. And so Klestakov, richly showered with gifts, with full pockets, and in the awareness of a trick splendidly brought off, left the town and rolled merrily away, while those left behind counted themselves fortunate to have bound so important a man to their family. After Klestakov's departure, the mayor and his wife still reveled entirely in their proud dreams of the future. They already saw themselves in the capital, in distinguished circles, ennobled by their daughter's brilliant match, and the mayor boasted of his future son-in-law before the assembled notables, and let the merchants, who had earlier tried to denounce him to the supposed inspector, feel his triumph. He had reached the summit of his self-satisfaction and savored the admiration and envy of the whole town. But into the midst of this festive mood burst the postmaster, pale and agitated, an opened letter in his hand. It was that letter Klestakov had written to his friend in the capital before his departure, and the postmaster, true to his old habit, had not sent it on, but had curiously opened and read it. What he found in it took his breath away, and now he laid it before the assembled company. In this letter, the whole truth was revealed. Klestakov wrote to his friend what a droll adventure had befallen him, how he had been taken here for a high inspector and heaped with money and honors, and he made merry in the most mocking words about the foolish officials of the town. Each one of them he singled out with a spiteful, well-aimed remark. The mayor, the judge, the postmaster, the warden, he left out no one, and he portrayed them all as the fools and cheats that they were. As the postmaster read out these lines, the happy, festive mood turned to sheer horror. One after another, they had to hear how the supposed inspector had mocked them, and the faces of the proud notables grew longer and longer. Scarcely had the horror over the letter subsided, scarcely had the cheated officials begun to vent their anger and shame, and to shift onto one another the blame for the foolish blunder, then the last and most monstrous thing happened. A gendarme entered and announced in an official voice that an official from the capital had just arrived, an inspector who travelled by express command and summoned them all before him without delay. The true inspector then, the real one, had now actually come. At these words, the assembled company was thunderstruck. All froze. In the very moment when they had only just grasped how shamefully they had been fooled, and how rashly they had thrown their money into the jaws of a vagabond good-for-nothing, the real catastrophe broke over them. The mayor stood as though struck by thunder, unable to bring out a single word, and with him the whole party stood rooted, each frozen in his posture, in mute terror. So they all remained, a company of petrified figures, each caught in his pose of horror, the one with arms raised, the other with mouth agape, the mayor in their midst, and over this silent, frozen scene, the end of the story descended. In this image of perfect stupefaction, in which all the folly, the vanity, and the mendacity of these people were held as if in a mirror, lay the true point of the whole. For now, they had to face the real inspection they had so long awaited in dread, and this time there was no escape and no excuse left. The punishment for their misdeeds, which they had hoped to evade through bribery and deceit, now stood bodily before the door. That was our short retelling of The Government Inspector by Nikolai Gogol. A cheerful and, at the same time, thought-provoking story of vanity and fear, of deceit and self-deception, and of a whole town that let its own guilty conscience lead it by the nose. Good night, and, if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.